here, and okay, I have to click that. I'm really excited to be talking to you all. I think our Delta Kappa chapter is just the best one of all of the others, and so thrilled to see how it's grown since we started it a long time ago on a snowy evening in Virginia, where our plenary speaker that was coming couldn't make it, but Michelle flew all the way from Kansas, I think is where she is. Michelle Robertson flew all the way to do the first induction. So that was exciting. So some people might not know who I am. I'm Carol Messmore. I'm a core faculty member in the MFT program. And I was program director until this past April. So I'm thrilled to be in knee deep, shoulder deep in teaching classes, and I just finished grading today. So that was a great posting you had on Facebook about what faculty are doing right now. So I became an infant mental health. Oops, I just turned it backwards. I became an infant mental health specialist a few years after I became licensed. I had no idea what it was, had never heard of it. And I was working in my county for a child. I've always worked for child welfare, whether it was for an agency or for the Department of Children and Families, working with families in the system. And this is in Florida, and my county in South Florida decided that they needed services for children age 0 to 5 and for families age 0 to 5 and perinatal women, pregnant women, and postpartum is booming. It's really escalating right now, but we didn't have trained therapists. So they offered free infant mental health training through the Florida State University Harris Infant Mental Health Program. You had to have a clinical degree. You had to have a clinical license, be fully licensed to take the training. So I was in the doctorate program at that time, and I was licensed. I asked one of my professors, should I do this? He's like, yeah, it's free, do it. And it completely changed my practice. And at that time, I was working with families who had children 2, 3, 4, 5 years old. We didn't really bother with them in therapy. And when I was in my master's program and we were seeing clients, if they had a young child, it would be who on the therapy team is going to go take the child out to the lobby and play with them while we see the family. And what a mistake that is. So these are some dated, I have to update these, so I apologize. This is some dated statistics, but at this time, 70% of family therapists did not include children. And if they did, they don't engage them. They give them a coloring book, or they give them Play-Doh and sit them in the corner with the dollhouse. And they don't pay attention to what the child is doing. And research has found that the intervention within, including all family members, you're all systemic. I'm preaching to the choir here. So this workshop is for non-systemic people, but I'm preaching to the choir. That intervention within the system is much more beneficial than working one-on-one. So it just, those clinicians who think, oh yes, I'm working with the children in this family, they experienced a trauma, and they take the children one by one and work with them, that is not as effective as getting everyone in the room and working with them together. That you've seen that if you're practicing or if you're in internship. So it's really important for us as family therapists and us as systemic therapists to really embrace the idea of including all children in the room. So infant mental health is about helping young children. And so it's defined 0 to 5. And so if you're working and you have to do a diagnosis, you know that the DSM starts at age 6. There's nothing in there for an infant. So there is a separate diagnostic manual, the DC 0 to 3R. It is a separate diagnostic manual, and there is a crosswalk over to the DSM or the I'm not remembering the numbers. I'm sorry. The letters, the acronym for the other, is it the other diagnostic code numbers. And so the DC 0 to 3R is just diagnostic codes for 0 to 5. And you can crosswalk it to the DSM. Therefore, you can use these diagnoses to bill insurance. So it's important to be trained. You can go buy it off Amazon, the DC 0 to 3R, but it's just as it's important for you to take a course in psychopathology for the DSM, it's important for you to learn about this. And there are many resources. If you just Google infant mental health, you will find all kinds of resources, depending on the state you live in. If you're in the state of Florida, we're now certifying infant mental health specialists. There's endorsements. If you live in the state of Texas or the state of Michigan, there's a license. So it's really from when I started in, early 2000s, you're doing infant mental health to now, there's so much more recognition. It used to be people say, infant mental health, what do you do? Sit on the floor and play with them? Yes, that's exactly what I do. That is exactly what I do. And I hopefully have the parents or caregivers down on the floor too. And we are all playing. That is what you do, because you learn. So we're helping these children regulate their emotions. Most of the time, children have been through some type of trauma, and it's different. The way an adult who has language, or even a child who has language and motor skills, experiences trauma and expresses it is different than the way an 8-month-old or 10-month-old expresses it. So think about if you have a car accident and you've got a 13-year-old who has a seat belted in, you're driving, you're seat belted in, the airbag goes off, you've got a 8-month-old who's in a car seat. Luckily, no one's hurt, but there's a lot of emotions happening with the kids and with you. You can talk about it with that 13-year-old, and the 13-year-old understands what happened. That 8-month-old, you can't talk and explain, oh, a car hit us, a car slammed into us from the back, but we are okay. You can't explain that to that 8-month-old. So they are going to express that emotion in different ways. So that's what infant mental health is about. It's helping families understand what's going on with their young children when they're expressing different emotions that aren't making sense to the parents or caregivers, and helping them learn how to regulate them different, helping the parents and caregivers form close relationships. And it's important for us, we learn from the family. It's all about the context of their community and their culture. We have to be respectful of what it means to be a child in that culture, what it means to be an infant in that culture, what it means to be a caregiver or parent in that culture. Okay, so this is something really interesting. We won't do it tonight, but if you're really interested in this is a link. So I'll figure out with you all how we can get this link on the PowerPoint. It's on YouTube. You could also just Google Edtronic still face. Edtronic was one of my trainers in my infant mental health program. He was a professor at Harvard, and also this is groundbreaking, the still face experiments. They're ages old, so the videos are very dated, but it was groundbreaking. What he did was, you have a baby and a parent, and they interact, the facial, oh, You have them go back and forth. So just think about, people you see, go to the mall, or it's post-COVID. There's not as many places to watch, playgrounds, or, anywhere there's a lot of people. Sit in the back and just watch how people interact with children. And so the caregiver, and he did use females, it was all mothers, biological mothers. So it wasn't a very diverse study, which if anyone wants to do research, I think it would be really cool to do this again, but do it with non-biological parents, do it with fathers, that's a whole other thing. But so they would interact, and then he would have the mother turn away and then turn back to the baby and have a still face. And immediately the baby gets distressed because the mother isn't responding. Immediately. And you can see the distress. It's just a fascinating video. But that's how important the relationship is to these little babies. They notice it's all the nonverbals. It's all the nonverbals. So you can read to your child, which is really important. You can read them anything. It's the tone of your voice. They don't understand those words. I used to read my son, Gregory Bateson, Steps to an Ecology of Mind. I wasn't quite sure what I was reading either, but he didn't understand it, but he had a great time because it was my tone of my voice. And we developed that relationship. So this is a great YouTube video to go find. This one too, the visual clift experiment, shows the power of a parent. You can go, I'll leave that as a cliffhanger. Go Google visual clift experiment on YouTube, and you can find those. So why is it important? Research demonstrates what you do in those first 3 years are critical for later years. So you give me a child that's having difficulties before the age of 3, before the age of 5. Work with a therapist and that family with that child. Things will be just fine in elementary school. But if you wait until elementary school, which is what happens now, because that's when the early intervention, they get into kindergarten, the teacher gets a little concerned, the child can't sit in circle time, or they're taking other children's toys, or they're hitting, or they're still not potty trained and they're in kindergarten. What's going on? Then they get assessed. Well, by the time they get intervention, they're in 2nd grade. So just think about it, if those children could have intervention at age 3 or 4. So then when they get into kindergarten, 1st grade, 2nd grade, they have a social emotional regulation, and they can learn. They can do what they're there in school to learn, versus having to have intervention or acting out or being held back. So if we look, how do you recognize suffering in young children? Because they can't tell you, hey, I'm in pain. Hey, I saw my mother hit, and I don't know how to handle that because my mother was crying and distressed, and I know what that means, but I can't verbalize it, and I can't even process it in the same way that my 7-year-old sibling is processing it, because I don't think in that same way. I'm not thinking in words. So I had worked with a supervisee who had an adult. Well, she was like 17. She was a teenager, but living independently. She had seen her biological father murder her entire family. And she survived because she was very young. And the smell of blood would trigger trauma. She didn't know what it was, and she had not been told what happened to her family. She knew they were not alive, and her father was in jail, but they didn't tell her, because people think, oh, little baby, they won't remember. They won't remember seeing the violence. They won't remember the fire. They won't remember the hurricane. the flood, whatever the trauma was, but they just remember it in different ways, and it impacts them. So all of these, the emotional suffering, so it could be for an older child or an adult, we're okay leaving a parent. I can go to my friend's house and stay overnight at the age of 13, and I'm not going to be traumatized. I can go spend the summer with family in another part of the country and be okay with it and not be traumatized and actually have a lot of fun. But for a very young child to spend time away from a caregiver, that can be traumatizing, and it's not always recognized. So you see that a lot if you work with children in foster care. They'll take a nursing baby away from a nursing mom. So not only is that child now not getting their breast milk, they only know that nursing mom. That's their caregiver. Now, maybe they were not the perfect mother, but they have been ripped away from the only mother they knew. So how can we support these babies who are now terrified in foster care with very loving foster caregivers? And so they get used to that caregiver. So let's say they're 8 weeks old, 12 weeks old when they're taken from bio mom, given to foster parents. They then start trusting and form that relationship with foster parent. Well, then what happens at 8 months? Oh, bio mom gets custody. Okay, now you go overnight back to, and they're like, wait a minute, what's going on? And they don't have language. So these are how things that people with language and our cognitive ability may not see as trauma is really trauma for young children. These are just some statistics. I mean, it's I'll give you this PowerPoint so we don't have to go through. You all know that children are often the symptom bearer. How many times have you had kids brought into therapy and you realize this is a family or a parent issue? This isn't a child issue? Because the children will assume the problem. And the great thing about children under the age of 5 is they don't know to lie. So if you want to know what's going on in a family, you want to know who the caregiver is, you watch those little ones. Because when something happens, they go to whoever is taking care of them in the session. So are they headed over to an older sibling? Or do they head over to the caregivers? Do they look up at the caregiver with excitement or with fear? It's really important. You can just watch the little ones and they can give you a lot of information about the family. So children that are not displaying emotions, maybe there's something going on. If they're really unregulated, they can't calm themselves. Could be something going on, or they're fearful. Not the ones, they're tugging on their caregiver's clothes. They want to stay with their caregiver. That's natural. We should never separate children from their parents, especially when we're doing an assessment. If you just want to work with the child, have the caregiver in the room, because otherwise they're going to be afraid. Even if they know you, even if they have fun with you, the caregiver is their safe spot. Now, if you know there's abuse going on, that's a whole different story. That's a whole different story. So children that just are not displaying curiosity, wanting to play, they don't want you to touch them, they can't self-soothe, they don't want anyone else to soothe them, they might not be turning to their caregiver. There's something going on, so you might want to be a little more curious about what's happening with those little ones. Because if it's not resolved now, when they become 7, 8, 13, 15, there's going to be other issues and more issues. So it's whatever we can support those children to become healthy socially and emotionally at this young age, they'll be healthier young children teens and adults. So that's more of signs. Let's see. So what's time? So I can tell you quickly about this case, and then we can talk about other cases if people have it. This is a really interesting case. I'm really interested in older moms because I became a first-time mother at 41, and it was quite interesting. Quite interesting. And I worked. I worked since I was 13 years old. I read all the parenting magazines, and I thought that my baby was going to sleep 18 hours a day because that's what those magazines say. Well, it's 18 hours a day, 5 minutes at a time with 7 minutes in between. So I had a colleague, an infant mental health colleague, called me and said, I just got the Christmas card from my cousin. I'm like, oh, nice. The one that had twins? She goes, yeah, there's only one twin on the card. Like, oh, interesting. So this was, so she asked me to work with her. So I did, and I went to the home because a lot of infant mental health work you will do in families' homes. So I went to her home. She had actually retired. She had been a vice president, very high-powered job, you know, daytimer, scheduled, had assistants, and she was pregnant with the twins, and there were complications. They were born very early, and the baby boy had pretty severe medical issues. So severe that they were in Palm Beach County. He had to be flown to Miami, to a hospital in Miami. So very difficult. That's like an hour drive for her to go see him. So he was in NICU, and they weren't sure he was going to survive. The baby girl was fine, full, you know, good weight. She was able to come home. And the baby boy stayed in NICU. And mom did not go down to see the baby. Dad would go down, drive down, and see the baby. So when they decided to do the Christmas card, it didn't even occur to mom to try to do the card at the hospital so they could have the baby in the picture. So when I started working with her, the baby came home, and so I just observed. She would not pick him up. He laid in the pack and play. She carried the little girl around. She just was kissing on her, all kind of, and she was responding and bubbling, and oh, it was all about this little girl. And this little boy is just laying in the pack and play, looking around. So, you know, he hasn't really had the bonding time with his mother, wasn't breastfed. You know, it just didn't have that opportunity. So he had colic. Colic doesn't really exist. Colic is what some pediatricians say would call I'm sorry, let me take that back. Colic does exist. Let me take that back. There are gastrointestinal issues. There are all kinds of things that can happen. So it's important, if your baby is having colic, to investigate the formula, the diet, all of it, because usually it's their tummy is just upset. Well, he had no allergies. There was no issue with the formula. He didn't have any problems in the hospital. But once he got into the home, he just cried and cried and cried. Well, he wasn't being picked up. So we started playing with the babies, and because she just would not pick him up, I would pick him up. And then I'm like, let's trade. And we just do things, walk around the house or go out and take him for walks, where she started holding him. And she made the connection that when she held him, he stopped crying. So we had to do that. And we talked about what it was like for her to have a baby in NICU. And it's what many moms will tell you. They go to the hospital to have a baby, and they leave the hospital without a baby. So she went to the hospital to have 2 babies. She left the hospital without any baby. She was able to get 1 baby shortly afterwards. And then the other baby, nobody saw, was way far away. If that baby had been closer to her, they could have been a little different, but baby was so far away, she couldn't get to that baby. So she had to process that grief and then allow herself, she was afraid that baby was going to die. So she had to allow herself to work through that and feel the joy that here she's got a healthy baby boy now. He's not going to die. He's okay. And he was gaining weight. He was, if he didn't get through this process, if she did not start picking him up and engaging with him, probably he would have been developmentally delayed. Because children that don't have that connection with their parents, who don't have any physical issue to cause a developmental delay or a neurological issue, can have delays because they just don't have that support and the nurturing of the parent. So it was really fascinating. It didn't take all that long. It was, maybe 6-7 sessions with her. And then by the end, she's bouncing both of them. If you've ever seen anybody with twins, they're just like magical how they can hold 2 in one hand, rocking them, laughing, having stories about both of the babies. So it was just helping her process that this baby is healthy and he's home, and she's the one that can help him soothe and teach him and that it was going to be okay. And she had to get through the fact that babies don't live on a day timer. So she can schedule all she wants, but it's really about what they want to do, when they want to do it, when they're infants. So there's a lot more in here. There's some statistics. This is pretty alarming. Each day in America, a child is abused or neglected every 54 seconds. And this I did go get updated data from. Every 54 seconds, a child is abused or neglected. And what's really alarming is over 50% of those cases are children younger than 6. So, those children often are not heard from. They're not in school, or they don't have language. 15% involved an infant. Every day, and every day 13 children are killed by a firearm. So I'll stop sharing those statistics. But that's why it's important